Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
In this video lesson, we're going to demonstrate how to calculate the effects of a protectionist tariff on the market for a particular good being imported into a country. Before watching this video, you should have already watched the videos on how to graph linear demand and supply equations, and perhaps the video on illustrating the gains of trade in a supply and demand diagram. The lessons taught in those videos will help you better understand what we're going to demonstrate in today's video. First, let's look at the market we're going to examine. This is the example I used in my class just yesterday. We looked at the market for wine in Switzerland. We observed that when you go to a grocery store here, there is actually a very small quantity of domestically produced wine available. And in fact, the vast majority of wine we buy in Switzerland, it comes from places like Italy and France and Spain and South America and the United States of America, Australia, and so on. So we're going to look at this market in today's lesson. Assume that the domestic quantity demanded for wine, as indicated here on the left, is represented by the equation 10 minus 0.6 p. To start off, I'm going to draw the demand curve for wine in Switzerland. The domestic demand for wine in Switzerland begins on the quantity axis at a quantity of 10 and intersects the price axis at a price of 16.67. Therefore, the blue curve represents the domestic demand for wine in Switzerland. Next, we can graph the domestic supply of wine in Switzerland. This represents the willingness and ability of Swiss wine producers to provide wine to the Swiss market. The q-intercept of the supply curve is -4 on our graph. Now, we don't usually draw the negative range of the supply curve, so we need to find the p-intercept, which once we have calculated it, turns out to be 5. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line starting at -4 and going through 5, and then I'll just shrink the line so that it only begins along the p-axis there. And what we've just drawn is the domestic supply of wine in Switzerland. Now let's look at the information we have on the left here. Let's assume that the Swiss wine market is completely open to free trade, and that the world price of wine is 6 francs per bottle. Now, as I explained in my class, the Swiss market for wine is relatively small to the entire world market for wine. What this means is that the Swiss wine consumer are essentially price takers. Swiss consumers can buy as many bottles of wine as they want at the world price of $6. So to illustrate the effect of free trade in the wine market, all we must do is draw a world supply curve that is horizontal at a price of $6. So the third line I'm drawing on my graph here represents the supply determined by the entire world supply of wine. The first question we want to answer on the left here is, what is the domestic quantity supplied and demanded of wine at a world price of $6? We can identify these points on a graph, but then we can provide a more accurate calculation of the domestic quantities supplied and demanded by plugging the price of $6 into our demand and supply equations. Let's do that now. We can see that the domestic quantity supplied of wine will be 0.8, and the domestic quantity demanded we can find by plugging the same price into the demand equation. And that gives us a domestic quantity demanded of 6.4 bottles of wine. So we can now label those points on our graph. The domestic quantity supplied of wine will only be 0.8, but the domestic quantity demanded will be 6.4. Now we can easily calculate the number of imported wine bottles following when the world price of wine is $6 and the domestic quantity supplied is only 0.8. Assuming the Swiss consumer wishes to demand 6.4 bottles, but only 0.8 are being imported, this means that 5.6 bottles of wine are being imported into Switzerland. Graphically, that's the difference between our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied. So we've already answered that later question. But let's answer a few more questions before we move on. First of all, what is the domestic producer revenue at a world price of $6? Assuming that domestic producers are only producing 0.8 bottles of wine and they're selling them for a price of $6 each, then we can easily calculate the domestic producer revenue by multiplying the price of $6 times the quantity of 0.8. And that gives us a domestic producer revenue of $4.8. how much domestic consumer surplus is there. You'll recall from earlier lessons in this course that the consumer surplus is the area beneath the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. And at a price of $6, the domestic consumer surplus is going to be the triangle that I outlined in yellow here. Domestic consumer surplus is simply the area of a triangle. In this case, it is the triangle between 16.67, which is our price intercept of demand, and $6, and the quantity of 6.4, all divided by 2. In this case, the area representing domestic consumer surplus is 37.34. Now this can be expressed in dollars as well. That represents the additional happiness of all the Swiss consumers resulting from free trade in the wine market. Now the last thing we can calculate before we look at the effects of a tariff is how much foreign producer revenue will be generated from free trade with Switzerland. We know that 5.6 bottles of wine will be imported at a price of $6 each. This gives us the total revenue earned by foreign producers of wine, which comes out to $33.6. We have just completed a quantitative analysis of the effect of free trade on the market for wine in Switzerland. We can see that the quantity supplied under free trade is much less than it would be without free trade. Without free trade, we could have calculated the domestic quantity supplied and demanded, which would have been found at the intersection of domestic supply and domestic demand. However, with free trade, only 0.8 bottles of wine will be produced by Swiss wine producers, but 5.6 will be imported for a total quantity of wine consumption of 6.4. In the next part of this lesson, we're going to examine the effect of a tariff or a tax placed on imported wine by the Swiss government. We want to look at how Swiss consumers, Swiss producers of wine, foreign producers of wine, and the Swiss government are affected by a tariff on imported wine. Now let's assume that the Swiss government has imposed a $2 per bottle tariff on imported wine. We've got some new questions we want to answer now. But first let's illustrate the effect of a $2 tariff on wine. You'll recall that a tariff, or a tax in this case, is a cost imposed on the producers of a particular good which reduces the supply of that good. Graphically, this will result in an upward shift of the world's supply curve by exactly $2. So the first thing we want to do is illustrate the effect of the $2 tariff. Notice that the world supply curve will shift upwards, reflecting that the cost to importers of wine will rise by $2 for every bottle that they import. The distance between the old supply curve and the new supply curve represents the $2 tariff, as we can see. Now, the world price with the tariff is equal to $8 per bottle. This increase in the price of wine in Switzerland should lead to an increase in the domestic quantity supplied and a decrease in the domestic quantity demanded. To prove that, let's go ahead and calculate the new domestic quantities supplied and demanded. We must plug $8 into our supply equation, and we'll see that the new domestic quantity supplied equals -4 plus 6.4, which is 2.4 bottles of wine. However, the domestic quantity demanded will, in fact, fall. The new domestic quantity demanded will be only 5.2 bottles of wine. We can plot both of these points on our graph by drawing the dotted line down from the intersection of the new world supply curve and the domestic quantity supplied and demanded. We can now calculate the new amount of domestic producer revenue. Domestic producers are definitely going to gain from a tariff on imported wine. The reason for this is that they are now selling their wine at a higher price of $8 per bottle, and in addition they're producing a greater quantity. The new amount of revenues earned by Swiss producers of wine is therefore $19.20. Domestic wine producers are definitely going to be better off from a tariff on imported wine. They're able to sell their wine at a higher price, and they're going to sell a much higher quantity of wine in addition. What about domestic consumer surplus? Recall that before, domestic consumer surplus was a much larger triangle than it appears to be now. The new area of domestic consumer surplus I'm outlining in yellow. Above the world price of $8 and below the domestic demand curve. Let's go ahead and calculate the area of this triangle. The height of the triangle will be the price intercept of 16.67 minus the price of $8. The base of the triangle is 5.2, which is the quantity of wine demanded after the tariff, and since it's a triangle, we must divide this by 2. The new area of consumer surplus in the market for wine in Switzerland is 22 $2.54. We'll compare that to the old amount of consumer surplus in just a moment, but we can see graphically at least that the consumers of wine in Switzerland are definitely going to be worse off since they're paying a higher price and they're consuming a smaller quantity of wine. What about the quantity of imports? Before the tariff, 5.6 wines were being imported into Switzerland. After the tariff, this is going to be drastically decreased. Since domestic producers are now providing 2.5 bottles of wine and domestic quantity has fallen to 5.2, the new amount of imports will be only 2.8 bottles of wine. Compared to before, when 5.6 bottles of wine were being produced, only half as much wine is being imported into Switzerland now. And as a result, we're going to see the revenues of foreign wine producers fall dramatically. How do we calculate the amount of revenues earned by foreign producers of wine? Keep in mind that the $2 of the tariff will not be earned by foreign producers of wine. That will go to the government. So to find the amount of producer revenue abroad, we must calculate the quantity of imports, that's 2.8 bottles, and multiply this by the price that they are earning from these sales, which is $6, and we'll get foreign producer revenue following the tariff. Foreign producers will earn only $16.8 from their business with Switzerland now. What about the Swiss government? This is a tax placed by the Swiss government after all. We can easily calculate the amount of tax revenue generated by this tariff. It's simply the quantity of bottles of wine being taxed times the amount of the tax. This is a simple calculation and it can be shown graphically as well. With a tax of $2 per bottle and with 2.8 bottles being imported, the tariff will generate $5.6 worth of tax revenue for the Swiss government. On the graph, this is illustrated as the green rectangle that I'm shading now. So overall, how has the Swiss economy been affected by the tariff on imported wine? To complete our analysis, we're going to put the original calculations that we did besides the new calculations that we've done and determine how overall welfare will be affected by this tariff. Let's compare the welfare in the market for wine before the tariff was imposed and the welfare after the tariff was imposed. First of all, let's examine the effect on domestic consumers of wine. Before the tariff, recall that domestic consumer surplus equaled $37.34. Notice that after the tariff, domestic consumer surplus is a much smaller number. Domestic consumers are suffering for two reasons, both because of the higher price of wine, $8 following the tariff, and more importantly because of the reduced quantity. Notice that before the tariff, quantity demanded was 6.4 bottles. After the tariff, domestic consumers in Switzerland will buy only 5.2 bottles of wine, each which they are paying a higher price for. What about domestic producers? Now we can look at the winners of the tariff. Before the tariff was imposed, domestic producers, Swiss wine producers, earned only $4.8 total in revenue. However, as a result of this tariff, domestic producer revenue is much greater. It has increased, in fact, by $14.4. Actually, let's go calculate the net loss of consumer surplus. Before the tariff, consumer surplus equaled 37.34, while after the tariff, consumer surplus equals only 22.54. This equals a net loss of $14.8. Notice immediately that the loss of consumer surplus is greater than the increase in the producer's revenue within Switzerland. Right away, we can probably conclude that this tariff will lead to overall a loss of total welfare. What about foreign producers of wine? Notice that before the tariff, foreign producers earned revenues equal to $33.6. This is business for foreign wine producers who may have a lower opportunity cost in wine production and therefore may be able to do it more efficiently than Swiss wine producers. Following the tariff, however, this amount of revenue was approximately halved. Therefore, foreign producers definitely suffer from this tariff on their wine. The one thing we have not yet accounted for is the government revenue generated. We can see that there is an area of revenue on a graph for the Swiss government. The $5.6 of government revenue, generated can go towards the provision of other goods and services for the Swiss economy. But overall, we must conclude that a tariff on imported wine in Switzerland is inefficient. Let's go back to our graph for one last analysis of why a tax on imported wine creates overall a loss of welfare in the Swiss economy. Here we can see the Swiss market for wine with a $2 tariff placed on all imported bottles of wine. We can complete our analysis by outlining a couple more areas on this graph to determine whether or not overall the Swiss market for wine is more or less efficient. Notice that the yellow triangle represents the consumer surplus following the $2 tariff being imposed on imported wine. We could also shade the area representing producer surplus as well. The producer surplus is everything below the price of wine and above the domestic supply curve, representing the purple triangle on our graph. The government revenue is highlighted in green, but if we look closely at this graph, we can see that there are two triangles that are no longer represented in the total welfare in the wine market in Switzerland. The two triangles which I'm outlining in blue represent the deadweight loss, or the loss of total welfare from the tariff on imported wine. We could actually go ahead and calculate the total amount of deadweight loss fairly easily. Let's do that. Let's do the one on the left first. We know that the base of the triangle on the left is 2.4 minus 0.8, which is 1.6. The height is the $2 tariff. If we divide that by 2, we'll see that the size of that triangle represents $1.6 of deadweight loss. What about the triangle on the right? The base of the triangle is 6.4 minus 5.2, which is 1.2. The height is the $2 tariff, and divide both sides by 2 to find the deadweight loss of $1.2. The total deadweight loss, or loss of total welfare, resulting from the tariff on imported wine is therefore 1.6 plus 1.2, which is $2.8 of welfare loss within the Swiss economy. The $2 tariff on imported wine helps domestic producers of wine, as seen by the increase in producer revenue and graphically the increase in the size of the purple triangle, as domestic producers are able to sell more wine at a higher price. Domestic consumers of wine, however, suffer dramatically. The consumer surplus decreases by more than the domestic producer surplus increases. The amount of government revenue does not make up for the total loss of welfare, which we have just shown is equal to the area of the two blue triangles on a graph, which comes out to $2.8.